a perfect day turns dark. The sun gleamed brightly over the bustling city, casting golden rays that bathed the streets in a soft, almost magical light. The air was warm but not unbearable, a slight breeze stirring the leaves of the trees along the sidewalk. The sidewalks were alive with activity, young couples enjoying ice cream, families laughing as they rushed to their next adventure, and groups of friends chatting, their voices blending into the symphony of a perfect summer day. Among the crowd, Maya Lewis, a woman in her mid-30s, pushed her wheelchair through the city streets with a steady determination. She had a grace about her, even with the added challenge of being in a wheelchair, a grace that spoke volumes about her inner strength. Her pregnancy was in its final stages, and though the days had become increasingly difficult, she refused to let that steal her joy. The decision to head to the amusement park today had been made on a whim. She wanted to see her son, Oliver, smile as he dashed from ride to ride, and maybe, just maybe, forget about the challenges of the past few months. Maya glanced down at her swollen belly, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and anxiety. This pregnancy had not been easy. There had been complications from the very beginning. Despite the medical issues, Maya had managed to keep a calm and optimistic demeanor, pushing through the exhaustion and pain as best she could. Her doctor had told her to take it easy, but there was something about the idea of spending the day in the amusement park with her family that made the possibility of pushing through her discomfort seem worth it. She glanced down at Oliver, her 6-year-old son, who was skipping ahead with his usual boundless energy, then looping back around to run alongside her wheelchair. His laughter was infectious, and Maya couldn't help but smile every time she heard it. He was wearing his favorite red t-shirt with superheroes printed across the front, his tiny sneakers tapping against the pavement. His excitement about the day ahead was palpable, and it lifted Maya's spirits in a way she hadn't expected. "Mom, can we go on the big Ferris wheel first?" Oliver asked, pulling on the sleeve of her dress, his voice filled with pure enthusiasm. "Of course, sweetheart," Maya replied, her voice warm but tinged with the fatigue she had been trying to hide all morning. "But we need to get a special pass for that first." The Ferris wheel had always been Oliver's favorite ride. He loved the idea of soaring above the park, seeing everything from the top. Maya had made a promise to him weeks ago that today, they would go on the Ferris wheel as soon as they arrived. Maya navigated the wheelchair toward a side entrance, one designated for visitors with disabilities. It was quieter here, away from the crowds of people making their way toward the main gates, and the shade from the nearby trees provided a welcome respite from the sun. As they neared the entrance, Maya could feel a weight in the pit of her stomach. There was something about today that felt different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She didn't let it stop her, though. Today was supposed to be about family, about joy, and she wasn't going to let any nagging doubts ruin that. As they neared the entrance to the accessible section, Maya noticed a security guard standing nearby. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his expression was stern, his eyes focused on the people entering. There was a certain unease in his posture, an energy that felt off. Maya tried to brush it off as just her own tiredness and continued pushing forward, her hands gripping the wheels with purpose. Oliver tugged at her sleeve again. "Mom, can we go on the Ferris wheel now?" His small voice was full of impatience. "We're almost there, sweetie," Maya reassured him, her fingers gently squeezing his hand. But as she got closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that the security guard's gaze was lingering a little too long. His eyes weren't warm, not like the usual friendly, welcoming faces she was accustomed to seeing at the entrance. Instead, there was a coldness to his stare, as if he was sizing her up in a way that made her feel small and out of place. When they reached the entrance, Maya tried to make eye contact with the guard, offering a polite smile, but he didn't acknowledge her greeting. His gaze was fixed on her, and something about it made her uneasy. "Excuse me," Maya said, trying to sound confident despite the rising discomfort in her chest. "We'd like to get a special pass for the Ferris wheel." The guard's eyes flicked over her, from her wheelchair to her swollen belly, before he narrowed them slightly. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Maya thought he might say something, but instead, he simply crossed his arms tighter. "Why do you need a pass?" he asked, his voice blunt and businesslike, almost challenging. Maya blinked, taken aback by his tone. She wasn't used to being questioned in such a manner, especially not when she was just following the park's protocol. "I'm pregnant, and it's difficult for me to stand in long lines," she explained, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm just here to enjoy the day with my son." The guard didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to examine her with a gaze that made her feel exposed. Maya felt her heart rate quicken, her nerves getting the better of her. She wanted to push through, to keep moving forward, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel vulnerable. "I'll need to see proof of your condition," the guard said, his tone now bordering on condescending. Maya's eyes widened slightly. "Excuse me?" "Your condition," he repeated. "I need to see proof. If you're really pregnant, you'll have no problem showing some kind of medical document." Maya was stunned. She had heard of people being made to feel uncomfortable in public spaces, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. She had never felt more humiliated in her life. She glanced down at her stomach, then at Oliver, who was looking up at her with a confused expression. Maya's mind raced. How could this man be so brazen in his actions? And why had he singled her out? What did he mean by proof? Before she could respond, the guard stepped closer to her wheelchair, his hand outstretched as though he was going to grab her documents himself. "Sir, that's not necessary," Maya said, her voice shaking slightly now as the frustration and embarrassment began to rise. "We're just here for the ride, and we've been through the proper channels." The guard didn't seem to care. He was insistent, pushing forward in a way that made Maya feel small, as if he were questioning her right to be there. Her hand tightened on the wheels, but she refused to back down. She wasn't going to let this man ruin her day, not now, not when she was so close to having some fun with her family. "Please, just let us through," Maya said, her voice more firm this time. But the guard's expression didn't soften. Instead, he looked her up and down one more time and then gave a barely perceptible nod, his lips curling into something that resembled a smirk. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside just enough to let her pass. But his words lingered in the air, sharp and pointed. "I'll be watching you." Maya was too stunned to reply as she wheeled herself through the gate, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Oliver was quiet now, his small hand clutching her sleeve as they moved into the designated area for people with disabilities. The ride ahead seemed less exciting than it had moments ago. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this was more than just an uncomfortable encounter with an overly cautious security guard. As they moved farther from the gate, Maya's unease only grew. She kept glancing over her shoulder, sensing that someone, or something, was following them. And then, it happened. From the corner of her eye, Maya saw a figure approaching. The air seemed to thicken, and every instinct told her that this wasn't just a regular person. She had no idea who they were, but her gut told her that the day she had envisioned, one filled with joy, with laughter, was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. The unexpected confrontation. Maya wheeled herself further into the quiet section of the park, her mind still racing from the uncomfortable encounter with the security guard. She tried to focus on Oliver, whose energy was starting to return. He was running ahead, his feet barely touching the ground as he darted from one side of the path to the other, his voice echoing with excitement. "Mom, I can see the Ferris wheel. It's so tall. It's gonna be amazing." Maya smiled, trying to push the unease from her mind. The sound of Oliver's joy was a balm to her nerves, and she focused on him, determined to not let the earlier confrontation sour their day. After all, the day had just begun, and she had promised her son that they would make this a special occasion, one filled with happy memories to look back on. "Let's go, sweetheart," Maya said softly, her voice steady as she guided the wheelchair in the direction of the Ferris wheel. Her body felt heavy, her back sore from the weight of pregnancy, but she refused to show it. Oliver's excitement was infectious, and it made Maya feel like she could push through the exhaustion. They approached the line for the Ferris wheel, where a group of people stood chatting excitedly, waiting for their turn. Maya glanced over at the entrance, her gaze lingering on the ride for a moment. It was one of those massive Ferris wheels that towered over everything, its lights flashing brightly even during the day. It was a perfect blend of awe and wonder, the kind of ride that made you feel both small and alive at the same time. Oliver's eyes were wide with amazement as he took in the sight. But just as they were about to approach the front of the line, Maya's breath caught in her throat. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the same security guard from before standing near the entrance to the Ferris wheel. He was talking to a few other park employees, but when he saw Maya approaching, his gaze immediately snapped to her. The coldness she had sensed before was back, stronger now, and his eyes bore into her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Maya's stomach churned with anxiety, her nerves flaring up once more. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never quite left her. As she wheeled closer to the entrance, the guard straightened up, his posture stiffening. Maya's pulse quickened, and she fought to keep her composure, focusing on Oliver instead of the security guard. "Mom, let's go. We're next," Oliver said, tugging on her sleeve impatiently. But before Maya could respond, the security guard moved toward them, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. His expression had hardened, and there was a palpable tension in the air now. It was as if everything had shifted in an instant. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach, and her instinct screamed at her that something was off. "Excuse me, ma'am," the guard said, his voice sharp and laced with authority. "I need to ask you to step aside." Maya stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. "What is it now?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but her frustration was evident. "I need to see some identification," the guard said, his words cold and dismissive. "We have rules about who is allowed to access certain areas." Maya stared at him, disbelief crossing her face. "I've already been through this," she replied, her tone growing more heated. "I don't need to show you anything." The guard's eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched. "I'm afraid you'll have to," he said, his voice hardening. "It's park policy." Maya's hands clenched around the wheels of her chair, her knuckles turning white. She had been patient. She had tried to understand. But now, the guard's actions were becoming more than just a minor inconvenience, they were starting to feel like an attack. Oliver, sensing the tension, stopped fidgeting and looked up at her with a confused expression. "Mom, why is he being mean to us?" Maya's heart broke at the sound of her son's innocent question. She could feel her emotions rising, a mix of anger and helplessness swirling inside her. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the day she had imagined for them. "Mom, we don't need to show him anything," Oliver added, his voice unwavering for his age. He seemed to sense the unfairness in the situation, and his small hands balled into fists, just like Maya's. Before she could say anything further, the security guard took a step forward, his stance more forceful. "I said step aside," he repeated, his tone rising. "We're not going to let you cause any more trouble today." Maya's mind raced. This wasn't just about a ride. There was something deeper here, something more sinister than a simple misunderstanding. The way the guard was speaking to her, the way he was treating her like she was an inconvenience, it didn't make sense. She tried to remind herself that people didn't always act the way they should, that sometimes fear or suspicion led people to do irrational things. But this felt different. It felt personal. Just then, a voice cut through the tension, strong and commanding. "Hey! What the hell is going on here?" Maya's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to see David standing at the edge of the crowd, his gaze locked onto the scene unfolding in front of him. He had arrived just in time, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. His posture was rigid, and there was no mistaking the seriousness in his expression. The guard hesitated for a moment, seemingly thrown off by the interruption. He glanced at David, who was now striding toward them, his every step deliberate and full of authority. The moment their gazes met, the guard's demeanor shifted. His expression faltered, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. David reached Maya's side in an instant, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but full of quiet menace. The guard opened his mouth to speak, but David didn't let him. "I'm asking you a question," David repeated, his voice sharper now. "What's going on?" The crowd around them had grown, drawn in by the rising tension. People were whispering, exchanging glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Maya could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her focus on David. His presence was calming, like an anchor in the midst of a storm. I was just doing my job," the guard stammered, his bravado from earlier now slipping away. "This woman." David cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No. You were not just doing your job. You were harassing my wife for no reason. I've had enough of your behavior." The guard's eyes widened as he tried to maintain some semblance of control, but it was clear that David wasn't going to back down. "You need to leave her alone," David said coldly, his hand tightening on Maya's shoulder as a silent show of support. Maya, feeling a surge of gratitude toward her husband, watched as the guard's confidence melted away. The crowd was silent now, the weight of the situation settling in the air. The park, once a place of joy and laughter, had turned into a tense standoff. "I think you owe my wife an apology," David added, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. The guard's face flushed a deep shade of red as the reality of his actions sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. The apology never came. Instead, he just nodded stiffly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. David's eyes didn't leave the guard's face. "You'll be reported," he said quietly, but the weight of the statement was enough to make the guard visibly recoil. "Now go. And don't let me see you here again." The guard, now trembling slightly, didn't argue. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly away, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet park. Maya let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She turned to David, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. David smiled gently, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "I'm just glad I made it in time." But the day wasn't over. The shadows of the encounter still lingered, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The unmasking. The Ferris wheel loomed above them, still as majestic as ever, but now it seemed to carry a heavier weight. Maya's hands gripped the wheels of her chair a little tighter as they moved toward the entrance, her mind still processing the events that had just unfolded. Oliver, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, skipped ahead, his excitement for the ride undeterred. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the atmosphere of the park. David walked beside her, his presence a comforting anchor, but even he was tense now, his jaw set in a way that signaled he wasn't entirely convinced the situation was over. He hadn't let the guard's actions slide, and neither would Maya. But there was something nagging at her, something she couldn't yet put her finger on. "Do you think he was working alone?" Maya asked quietly, her voice laced with concern. David's expression darkened, his eyes scanning the park with a subtle wariness. "I don't know," he said, his tone measured but filled with a quiet intensity. "I don't like how he reacted. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Something's off." Maya nodded, her stomach tight with unease. The events had unfolded so quickly, but now that the adrenaline had worn off, the deeper implications of the encounter were starting to sink in. The guard's behavior hadn't been just about enforcing rules, it had been personal, cold, and threatening. It wasn't just about Maya's wheelchair or pregnancy, it was about something more. As they reached the entrance to the Ferris wheel, Maya glanced at David. He had his phone in his hand, his thumb tapping against the screen. She knew he was already making calls, reaching out to the right people. He'd been a part of enough investigations to know that sometimes, things weren't what they seemed. "I'm going to check in with a few colleagues," David said, his voice low and steady. "Just to make sure everything is handled properly." Maya nodded, her heart still heavy with questions. She watched as David stepped away, disappearing into the crowd with a purposeful stride. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that he was handling it, but a new sense of dread began to settle over her as she sat alone for a moment, watching Oliver eagerly talking to a park attendant about the ride. The park was bustling with people, the sounds of laughter and music filling the air, but to Maya, everything felt distant now. The normal excitement of a day at the amusement park had been replaced with a pervasive sense of danger, like a dark cloud hanging over her. She looked around, her eyes darting from one person to the next, wondering if anyone else could sense the shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the park's light-hearted facade had cracked, and the undercurrent of something more sinister was beginning to show. Maya felt a shiver run down her spine when she saw the figure again. The same security guard. Standing at the edge of the crowd, staring directly at her. His cold eyes locked onto hers from across the walkway, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Maya's pulse quickened, her body instinctively tensing as she locked eyes with him. The guard didn't move. He just watched, his gaze unblinking, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a move. Or maybe he was just daring her to do something. Maya couldn't decide which. All she knew was that the uneasy feeling in her gut had intensified, and she couldn't look away from him. She felt her hands tremble slightly as she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, but she refused to let fear control her. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her. Not now. Not ever. Oliver's voice broke through the tension. "Mom! Can we go now?" He was standing by the entrance to the ride, his face lit up with a wide grin. "I can't wait any longer." Maya quickly turned her attention back to her son. She forced a smile onto her face, her heart still racing from the encounter. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, trying to sound calm. "Let's go." She wheeled herself forward, determined to put the confrontation behind her. The Ferris wheel was just a few steps away now, and she was eager to see Oliver's face light up when he saw the view from the top. It was the one thing that could still bring a sense of normalcy to their day. She just had to get through this ride. As she wheeled toward the entrance, a hand suddenly grabbed her shoulder, pulling her to a stop. Maya's heart leaped in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. She instinctively tried to jerk away, but the hand on her shoulder tightened, holding her in place. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was familiar, and the coldness in it made her blood run cold. It was the security guard. Before she could react, a voice came from behind her, sharp and commanding. "Let her go." David's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. He had returned, his presence instantly calming Maya, even as the guard's grip on her shoulder tightened. The guard turned slowly, his eyes flashing with recognition. For a moment, there was a tense silence between them. David was close now, his posture unyielding, his eyes locked onto the guard with an intensity that Maya had never seen before. "You should be careful who you touch," David added, his voice low but laced with authority. "I've already spoken to the manager. Your actions have been reported, and there's an investigation underway. Do you really want to make things worse for yourself?" The guard's face hardened, his jaw clenching in frustration. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes flicking from David to Maya, and then back again. It was clear that he was trying to gauge how much trouble he was really in. "Let go of her," David repeated, his voice firm, yet controlled. "Now." The guard's hand wavered for a moment, and Maya felt a wave of relief flood through her when he finally released her shoulder. The guard took a step back, his expression darkening, but he didn't speak. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, his steps heavy with defeat. Maya's heart raced, but she exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her body begin to ease. She looked up at David, who was still standing close by, his eyes never leaving the guard as he disappeared into the crowd. "You okay?" David asked softly, his concern evident in his gaze. Maya nodded, though her heart still pounded in her chest. "I am now. But something's not right, David. Why did he single me out? Why did he act like that?" David looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he sighed deeply. "I don't know, but we'll get to the bottom of it. I won't let this slide. But for now, let's just focus on you and Oliver. You deserve to have a good time today." Maya didn't argue. She turned her chair toward the entrance of the Ferris wheel again, forcing a smile onto her face as Oliver bounced on his heels, his excitement palpable. "Let's go," Maya said, her voice filled with determination. David walked beside her, and they moved toward the ride. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world had righted itself. But deep down, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The guard's behavior wasn't a mistake, it was a warning. Someone had targeted her, and she couldn't ignore it. The truth comes out. The Ferris wheel loomed larger with each passing moment as Maya and David wheeled toward the entrance. The earlier encounter with the security guard still lingered in her mind, but for Oliver's sake, Maya had forced herself to focus on the present. Her son was practically bouncing with excitement, practically pulling her in every direction, eager to get onto the ride. "Mom, it's so high. I can't wait," Oliver chirped, tugging her arm with enthusiasm. Maya smiled down at him, but the unease gnawing at her stomach refused to dissipate. The security guard's eyes still felt like they were on her back, even though he had walked away. She tried to shake the feeling, but a knot remained tight in her chest. There was something about today, about the way things had escalated, that didn't sit right with her. As they approached the line for the ride, Maya couldn't help but glance around. The park seemed as lively as ever, the sounds of children laughing, music playing, and people chatting drifting on the breeze. It should have been a joyful day, a day to forget the struggles of pregnancy, of the complications, and the isolation that often came with it. But instead, Maya felt as though an invisible weight was pressing down on her shoulders. David, sensing her distraction, placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Maya nodded, her lips tight as she tried to keep her composure. "I can't help it. The way he looked at me, there was something about it. Something more than just being a security guard. And the way he was so insistent, it wasn't just about following the rules. It felt personal." David's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The security guard was nowhere to be seen, but Maya wasn't ready to dismiss the incident so quickly. "You know," David continued, his voice still steady, "I've seen a lot in my line of work. And the way he acted wasn't just some random flare-up. There's something bigger here. Something behind his behavior. I'm going to find out what." Maya felt her chest tighten at his words. David's job often involved uncovering secrets, hidden motives and darker truths, but she didn't want to drag him into something that could jeopardize their day, their family. She turned to him, trying to offer a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't want you to get caught up in this, David. It's just some angry guy who had a problem with me being pregnant and in a wheelchair. It happens. I don't need you to make it a bigger deal." David's gaze softened, but there was a resoluteness behind his eyes that told Maya he wasn't going to let this slide. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't just about you. This is about the way people treat others. About injustice, about making sure that things don't go unnoticed just because they're uncomfortable. I won't let that go. I'll figure out what's going on. Maya opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, the ride attendant waved them forward, calling out, "Next." Oliver dashed ahead, eager to climb into one of the large Ferris wheel gondolas. Maya, taking a deep breath, pushed the wheelchair forward, determined to put her concerns aside for just a moment. This was supposed to be about Oliver, about giving him a normal day despite everything else. As they made their way to the gondola, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the atmosphere had shifted. Even the laughter around them seemed to have become muffled, distant. It was an irrational fear, one that had no real reason to exist, yet it felt real. David remained at her side, his hand on her shoulder, as they reached the gondola. The attendant, a young woman with a bright smile, helped Maya into the seat, adjusting the safety bar around her. Oliver practically bounced in his seat beside her, his excitement almost contagious. "You ready, Mom?" Oliver asked, his face lighting up with joy. Maya forced another smile, her thoughts still a jumble. "I'm ready, sweetie. Let's enjoy this." The Ferris wheel began to turn, slowly lifting them off the ground. As the gondola creaked upward, the world below shrank, the park becoming a patchwork of colors and lights. The wind rushed through Maya's hair, and for a moment, the weight on her chest lifted just slightly. She gazed out over the horizon, the beauty of the park and the vast city stretching out before her. But her peace was short-lived. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the calm. He pulled it out, his face immediately changing as he read the message. Maya glanced at him, noticing the sudden shift in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. David's eyes flicked to her, then back to the phone screen. His jaw clenched. "I need to make a call," he muttered, standing up and stepping away from the gondola's edge. Maya's heart sank. She knew that tone. David's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, one that said things were escalating in a way neither of them could predict. She reached out to touch his arm, her hand trembling slightly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David paused, his gaze steady. "I don't know, but I just got a message from someone at the park's management office. They said there's been a report about me, about the incident with the security guard. It's been flagged as a possible case of harassment, and I'm being asked to come in for questioning." Maya's eyes widened in shock. "What? Why?" David took a deep breath, his expression hardening. "They think we're making a scene out of nothing. They think I'm overreacting. I need to get to the bottom of this, Maya. I need to understand why this is happening." Maya felt a surge of frustration and fear wash over her. "No, David. They can't possibly be blaming you for this. You were just protecting me and Oliver." David nodded grimly. "I know. But this isn't just about us anymore. There's something happening here. And I have to figure out what." Maya sat in stunned silence as the Ferris wheel continued its slow ascent, the world below them becoming even smaller. She wanted to protest, to tell him to let it go, but she knew better. David was a man who couldn't let something go if he believed there was an injustice at play. He stepped back toward her, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm sorry, Maya. I'll make sure this doesn't escalate any further. But I need you to trust me on this." Maya swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. Trust him? She had always trusted him, but this was different. This wasn't some routine case. This was personal. As the Ferris wheel creaked to a stop at the top, the view stretched endlessly before them. Maya looked out over the horizon, her thoughts a whirlwind. What had started as a simple trip to the park had turned into something much more complicated. And she feared that the road ahead wouldn't be as smooth as the Ferris wheel ride beneath them. The air around them felt heavy, filled with unspoken truths and secrets that hadn't yet been revealed. Maya knew, deep down, that there was more to the security guard's actions than met the eye. And now, with David drawn deeper into this tangled web, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger was at play, something that would change everything. The fall. The Ferris wheel creaked as it descended slowly, and Maya's mind raced faster than the ride could ever go. David's quiet intensity had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The words he'd spoken, about the park management, the report on him, nothing about this felt like it was going to resolve itself easily. She looked out over the horizon as they neared the ground, trying to steady herself, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. Oliver, still caught up in the magic of the ride, didn't notice the shift in the atmosphere. His eyes were wide with wonder as the ground grew closer, and the park stretched out below them. Maya envied him for his ability to see the world through the lens of excitement and innocence, unaware of the complexities around them. When the Ferris wheel finally came to a stop and the attendant unlocked the gondola door, Maya felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure whether it was the uncertainty of what was about to unfold or the fear that they were being watched again. She glanced around nervously, but the crowd continued to mill about, some oblivious to the drama that had unfolded earlier, others seemingly too lost in their own worlds to notice the tension. David helped Maya out of the seat, his hand steady on her arm, as they made their way toward the exit. She could see that he was in a hurry now, his jaw set tight, the unspoken resolve in his eyes making her heart race again. "Stay close," David said, his voice low but commanding. "We need to get to the office. I don't want to be out here longer than necessary." "David, what are we going to do?" Maya whispered, her voice strained. "This isn't just about some miscommunication. There's something else. Someone is behind all of this." David stopped for a moment, looking down at her with an expression that was a mixture of determination and concern. "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to let this go. If someone is behind this, I'm going to find out who they are. No one does this to my family." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She knew the depth of his resolve. But even more than that, she knew how far he would go to protect them. The danger was real, and it had never felt closer. She didn't want to admit it, but the possibility of facing whatever was lurking in the shadows terrified her. They walked through the park with haste, weaving through crowds, and the noise around them seemed to grow louder with each step, the cacophony almost drowning out her thoughts. Oliver, noticing the change in the mood, fell silent beside her. His small hand reached for hers, his fingers curling around her palm with a sense of unspoken worry. Maya squeezed his hand gently, trying to offer him the comfort she wasn't sure she felt herself. As they reached the main park office, Maya felt her stomach tighten again. She had never been inside the administrative area of the park, and she was painfully aware of how everything had shifted from a joyful day to something far more ominous. The cool, sterile air of the office contrasted with the vibrant energy of the park outside, and it made everything feel even more surreal. David led her into a small waiting area, where an older woman behind a desk looked up at them. Her expression was polite, but there was an edge of uncertainty in her eyes when she saw David. "Agent Lewis," she said, her voice laced with unease. "We've been expecting you." David's eyes darkened, and Maya could feel the weight of the unspoken tension between them. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge. This is becoming more than just an incident with a rogue guard. I want answers, and I want them now." The woman hesitated for a moment, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. She picked up the phone, spoke to someone briefly, and then hung up. "Please follow me," she said, standing up and leading them down a hallway to a conference room at the back of the building. Maya's heart hammered in her chest as they entered the room. The lights were dim, the air thick with anticipation. The man waiting for them at the table was unfamiliar to her, but David's expression as he locked eyes with him sent a ripple of discomfort through her. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked too formal for the amusement park, his posture rigid. He was flipping through a stack of papers when they entered, and without looking up, he motioned for them to sit. "David Lewis," he said flatly, his voice cool. "I assume you've come to discuss the incident." David didn't sit. "I haven't come for a discussion," he replied evenly. "I came for an explanation. You've got a guard targeting my wife, and I want to know why." The man, whose name they hadn't yet learned, finally looked up. His eyes narrowed, and there was an unsettling glint behind them, one that made Maya feel like a pawn in a much larger game. "Targeting your wife?" "I think you've overreacted, Agent Lewis," the man said dismissively, his lips curling into a tight smile. "Our security team is well trained. There's nothing unusual about what happened." Maya could feel the heat rise in her chest, but David's calm demeanor seemed to steady her. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me about the guard," David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I want his full background, his assignments, and if there's been any reports filed about him before." The man, who had introduced himself as Mr. Harlan, leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him as though he was preparing for a chess match. "You've been quite the troublemaker, Agent Lewis," he said with a thin, humorless smile. "We don't have the information you're asking for. Our staff is well vetted, and I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." David's jaw tightened. "You're lying." Maya watched the exchange carefully. There was something in Mr. Harlan's words, his body language, something that didn't add up. She could feel it in her bones. They weren't just dealing with an overzealous security guard anymore. There was something much darker beneath the surface. "I don't think this is a misunderstanding," Maya spoke up, her voice steady, though the tension in the room was palpable. "There's a reason why he singled me out. It wasn't about following rules. He made it personal, and we need to understand why." For the first time, Mr. Harlan's composure faltered. His lips pressed together tightly, and he glanced at the door, as though considering whether to continue. David wasn't going to let up. "Who's behind this? Who's running the strings here? You've had a chance to explain it away, but now you're stalling. Tell me who sent him." Mr. Harlan sighed, his expression darkening as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You've dug too deep, Agent Lewis. The guard's behavior wasn't random. But you'll be wise to stop now. There are things going on here that you won't want to uncover. And people who don't like being exposed." Maya felt a chill run down her spine as Mr. Harlan's words echoed in her mind. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David stood up suddenly, his eyes locked onto Mr. Harlan's with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "I'm not walking away from this. Not now. Not ever." The man's face hardened. "Then you're making a dangerous choice, Agent Lewis. And it won't just affect you. It'll affect your family too." Maya's stomach dropped as she realized just how serious the situation had become. This wasn't a simple case of harassment. It was something much bigger, and the danger was only beginning to unfold. A new beginning. The conversation with Mr. Harlan had left Maya feeling unsettled, the words still echoing in her mind. "It won't just affect you. It'll affect your family too." Those words had sunk into her bones, chilling her to the core. She hadn't expected any of this, but now it was clear that what had started as an ordinary visit to an amusement park had spiraled into something far darker. The park, once a place of carefree laughter and excitement, now felt like a maze filled with hidden dangers and ominous shadows. David had stayed silent during the rest of the meeting, his jaw clenched tight as he processed what Mr. Harlan had said. After the conversation, they'd left the park office, but neither of them had said much. The weight of the situation seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, as they walked through the park's now empty corridors. Maya, though still shaken, tried to steady her breathing, her heart racing as her mind churned over the implications of everything that had just happened. They had learned so little, yet so much at the same time. The guards' actions weren't random. They were part of something much larger, something more sinister than just a power trip or a misunderstanding. There was a deliberate effort to target her, to make her feel powerless. David had promised her that he would get to the bottom of it, but even his unwavering confidence couldn't quell the growing fear she felt for herself and her family. Who was behind this? What were they planning? And, most terrifying of all, why had they chosen her? As they neared the park's exit, Maya caught sight of Oliver. He was sitting on a nearby bench, munching on a cotton candy he had gotten after their ride. His face was smeared with pink sugar, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal again. It was hard to reconcile the cheerful image of her son with the dark reality that was slowly closing in around them. David took a step toward him, but Maya hesitated, her mind still spinning. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control, and every step seemed like it could tip her over into a place from which there would be no return. The mystery behind the security guard's actions had cracked open a door to a world she had never wanted to be a part of, and now, with each passing moment, that door seemed to open wider. "Hey, sweetheart," David said softly, walking toward Oliver, who looked up at them with a bright smile, unaware of the tension that had gripped his parents. "You enjoying your cotton candy?" "Yeah, Mom. It's the best," Oliver said through a mouthful of sugar, his face lighting up with the kind of joy that only a child could muster. Maya smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She leaned down, ruffling Oliver's hair gently. "I'm glad you're having fun, darling. But we need to head home soon. We've had a bit of a rough day, okay?" Oliver blinked up at her, his excitement faltering slightly. "But, Mom, I don't want to leave yet. There's so much more to do." David crouched down next to him, his voice soft but firm. "We'll come back, Oliver. I promise. But right now, we need to make sure everything is okay. We have to take care of some important things." Maya's heart ached as she watched her son's face fall, the innocence of his wishes crashing against the weight of the reality they were facing. The day had been meant to be an escape, a way for them to forget everything else, pregnancy complications, work stress, and all the challenges they had been enduring. But instead, it had turned into a nightmare that was only beginning to unfold. David stood up, taking a deep breath. "Come on, let's get going. We'll talk more when we're home." They began walking toward the exit, with Oliver trailing behind, still clutching his cotton candy. The exit seemed far too quiet now, the noises of the park outside muted by the lingering tension between them. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Maya felt a rush of relief. The open sky, the city streets stretching out before them, felt like an escape. But she knew it wasn't. Not anymore. The drive home was quiet. Oliver was dozing off in the back seat, the soft hum of the car and the gentle rock of the road lulling him to sleep. Maya kept glancing at David, trying to read the expression on his face, but he was silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched, and the quiet between them felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. When they finally arrived home, David helped Maya inside, keeping a steady hand on her back as she made her way into the house. Oliver stirred in the car, but David told him to stay asleep, assuring him that they would talk more when he woke up. Maya appreciated David's care, but she could tell that his mind was far from the present moment. He was still processing everything, still trying to figure out who had orchestrated the events of the day, and what it all meant. Once inside, David turned to her, his eyes locking with hers, his expression serious. "Maya, I need you to listen to me. I'm going to get answers, but this isn't something we can handle alone. We're not just dealing with some random guard with a grudge. There's something bigger going on here, and I need to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She had known deep down that this wasn't just about a rogue security guard, but hearing it out loud, hearing the resolve in David's voice, it made the reality of the situation all too clear. "What do you mean? Who's behind this?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to walk toward the study, grabbing his phone and setting it on the desk. He paced for a few moments, his mind clearly racing through everything that had happened. Finally, he looked back at her, his expression grim. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice low. "But I will find out. We can't just sit here and pretend like nothing's happening. I've already made a few calls. People know I'm looking into this. And trust me, Maya, I'll uncover everything. But I need you to stay safe. I need you to trust me, because whatever this is, it's not over." Maya nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew he was right. They couldn't ignore it anymore. But the idea of David getting tangled up in something so dangerous, something that could reach further than the park, further than anything they had imagined, filled her with fear. "David, what if they come after us? What if we're already too far in?" David stopped pacing, turning to her. "We'll deal with it as a family. We'll be strong. I won't let anything happen to you or Oliver. Not now, not ever." Maya felt the familiar warmth of his words, but even as she nodded, her mind was filled with questions. Who were these people? What did they want? And why had they targeted her in the first place? For now, there were no answers. Just more questions, more uncertainty. And yet, as she looked into David's eyes, she knew that together, they would face whatever was coming. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about them, about their family's future. The road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but Maya wasn't alone. She had David, and together, they would find a way through the darkness.